Hey kiddos, I got cut off. So I guess you can only record a certain amount of time and I got kind of carried away. So let me just finish off chapter 8 and then we'll jump to 9 in a skosh. Apologize. That is so stupid. No, actually, you're stupid. Greg felt his face getting red, felt his heart pounding. And then, for the second time in one day, Greg felt his nose begin to bleed. Only this time it was a real gusher. Blood streamed out his left nostril, over his lips, and dripped off of his chin, spattering his shirt and the desk. So notice the choice of words that author uses there to give you the good visual so you can see the blood and the, yeah. Mr. Z put one hand over his mouth and with the other, he pointed a shaky finger, his eyes wide. Your nose, it's, but he couldn't say the B word. Mr. Z's face went pale as paper. Pale as paper. What figurative language is that? Comparing his face to being pale as paper. A simile. Sweat stood out on his forehead, and behind the hand still covering his mouth, his breath came in gasps. Earlier, Greg hadn't noticed Mr. Z's reaction to blood. This time he couldn't miss it, and he decided to enjoy it. Greg leaned forward and nodded at Mr. Z, making no effort to stop the flow. Yes, my nose is bloody, very bloody. It's bleeding, and blood is getting all over the place. Bloody, bloody, bloody. Mr. Z turned away, almost throwing up. Greg, Morris snapped. Stop it! That's mean. She'd already grabbed the tissues from the teacher's desk. Here, and she pushed the box into Greg's hands. Turning to Mr. Z, she said, Can I get you something? Some water? Mr. Z shook his head. I just need to lie down. And with Mora to steady him, he eased out of the desk and onto the floor, flat on his back, eyes closed. Now you, Mora said to Greg, sit on the floor and lean forward and squeeze your nose. Hard. Greg followed orders, but then decided he'd be more comfortable lying down. Mora said, I'll get the nurse, and a cold pack, 2 cold packs. And she left Greg and Mr. Z littering the floor of room 27. And by littering, I mean lying on the floor, right? Before we go to chapter 9, and I don't want to give you a huge writing assignment today because you were working on your dialogue from yesterday and you might still be finishing that. So go ahead and finish that if you need to. I also want you to do a little bit of a comparison between Greg and Mora. So with your pencil and paper, hit pause and go grab that if you don't have that, and then come back to me. With your pencil and paper, I want you to do the Venn diagram. Do you remember the Venn, where we do the circles connecting in the middle? Here, I can do it on my little sticky note if you forget. Venn diagram. And then I want you to write Greg and Mora, like that. Okay, then I want you to put the characteristics of Greg in one side and the characteristics of Mora on the other, and then what they have in common in the middle. And you guys know how to do this. We've done it before. Okay, so this is more character analysis because I want you to just be thinking about how they're the same, how they're different, using adjectives. So go ahead and hit pause and then work on your Venn diagram, and you can add to it as we continue on with chapter 9. And I'll see you in a bit. All right, kids, chapter 9. In chapter 8, you finished that and you worked on your dialogue, and then you did the Venn diagram with Greg and Mora, and you were drawing inferences about the two characters. Inferences are important text evidence you use to get information about something. So we can get a lot of information about Greg and Mora from about their characteristics just from the way they talk to each other, how determined they are. They have a lot in common, okay? Chapter 9 is called Apologies. So we're just going to get started. I'll read chapter 9 and then let's see, I think I can get through that with my time. And then we'll decide if we're going to do a writing or if I give you a break today. I might just have you do a summary. Apologies. Greg lay on his back completely still, even with one nostril plugged. He picked up the oily scent left over from last night's dust mopping. He washed the second hand on the big wall clock and listened to Mr. Z's deep breaths. His math teacher was also stretched out on the floor, about 10 feet away. And Greg thought, now I'm completely sunk. This guy is going to ruin me. And then another, deeper voice said, yeah, and I deserve it. And Greg knew the second voice was telling the truth. He said, Mr. Z? In a voice so weak it was hard to hear. Mr. Z said, yes. I'm sorry about the blood stuff. After I saw it made you sick, Mora's right. It was mean. So I'm sorry. Mr. Z was quiet. Then he said, I know it's irrational. My reaction to that. It's only a liquid and only a word. but seeing it and hearing that word and thinking about it, it gets me every time. Greg thought a moment. He said, with me, it's snakes, and lying there on the floor. Greg shivered. I don't even like pictures of them. Mr. Z said, oh, yes, pictures. When I was in junior high, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I went to the public library and found a medical textbook. It had pictures. That was the end of my medical career. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Irrational. Anyway, apology accepted. After a moment, Mr. Z said, what about the other matter? Losing your temper over the little books? Any apologies for that? Gray didn't say anything. Mr. Z said, earlier when I told you I was delayed in the office, I was looking through your student file and Morris. You two have quite a history of conflict, and I thought I was going to be the big problem solver. I thought getting you to apologize would help for both of you. Greg turned his head to look at Mr. Z, moving a little so his legs of the desk didn't block his view. The teacher had his eyes shut, and his face still looked pale. But you don't understand, Greg said. About my comic books, I mean. I worked all summer. It's like the whole business I'm trying to start, and it'll make tons of money. And at the start of math class, I was thinking Maura would mess it up. What? You don't think that anymore? Asked Mr. Z. Not really, said Greg. I got a better look at her mini book. She's drawing all her pictures by hand, making her books one at a time. And you're not? No, said Greg. I make one original and then print the rest using a copier. Ah, said Mr. Z. Mass production, economies of scale, increased profits, and market dominance, right? Greg only stood about half of that, but he said, right. I can make 40 or 50 copies in an hour, and the materials cost around 2 cents per copy. Then I sell each one for a quarter, and I've got about 20 more comics all planned out. Mr. Z opened his eyes and turned his head to look at Greg. You see that? Talking was good. Help me understand. So why didn't you just talk to Maura? Greg shrugged. Because she's so annoying. Mr. Z's eyes drifted to the blood on Greg's shirt, and he quickly turned his eyes to the ceiling. He said, I've got a theory about why you two keep fighting. You're both very much alike, and you're each too stubborn to take a step toward being friends. And that could be a commonality you put in the middle of your Venn diagram. Stubborn. Greg wasn't sure what to say to that, and while he was thinking, Maura came back to the room with the principal right behind her. Mrs. Davenport said, My goodness, looks like an emergency room in here. A bleeder and a fainter. Come face to face. What are the odds of that? If we can patch up the math teacher, he can run the numbers and figure that out. She chuckled. Mrs. Emmett's gone, so I'm your nurse, like it or not. She went to Greg first and handed him a cold pack. Maura tells me you already know what to do with this. Greg nodded and pressed the blue plastic bag against his nose. The principal gave a towel and a cold pack to Mr. Z and then pulled a desk closer and lifted his feet to the seat. Get the feet above the head. It's the first aid for being strong, swooning victims. Mrs. Davenport chuckled again. Mr. Z did not. The principal said, Greg, I've already called your mother, and she'll meet you at home. Maura's mother is coming in about 5 minutes, and she's driving you both. Then she turned to Maura and said, would you go to the girls' room across the hall for me? Wet paper towels? We've got to get Greg cleaned up so that Mr. Xenotopoulos can get off of the floor. Or we could just wait until it gets dark and all the blood comes invisible. She chuckled and then said, sorry about the jokes. I'm just relieved this isn't more serious. Then turning back to Mr. Z, she said, and I know all the other teachers will also be relieved when I tell them all about it tomorrow. More chuckles. Greg had never heard Mrs. Davenport make a joke before and had not known such a thing was possible. And lying there on the floor, Greg thought, Mr. Z is going to get teased by all the teachers tomorrow because blood makes him faint. And I'm going to get teased by the kids because I have a black eye from a girl. Mrs. Davenport used the wet paper towels to clean up Greg's face and the desk and the floor. It was a big mess. And before she was done, Maura had to go back for more supplies. All right, Greg, up you get. Slowly. Keep your head steady. Mrs. Davenport held Greg to his feet and then to his desk. Stay put while Maura waits for her mother out front. I've got to get back to the office. Mr. Xenotopoulos, will you be all right for another few minutes? Or should I call for an ambulance? There's a picture for you. Turn your page to 92. Greg could hear her chuckling as she walked away. He looked down at Mr. Z and said, does she always joke around like that with teachers? 'Cause she's not like that with the kids. Mr. Z smiled weakly. Didn't seem proper to talk about Mrs. Davenport with a student. So he said, most teachers have a sense of humor, and that includes principals. Greg stared down at his blue and white soccer shirt, now streaked with blood. Greg thought, red, white, and blue. Very patriotic. He moved the desk so Mr. Z wouldn't be able to see his front. Then he thought of a question. So, Mr. Z, do you wish sometimes that you could have been a doctor, like you said? Or maybe some other job like that? I mean, instead of just being a teacher, because if you had been a doctor, you'd probably be really rich by now. Doctors make so much money. You know, Ed McNamara, his dad's a doctor, and they're super rich. Just a teacher, seriously? Mr. Z did not want to discuss his personal life. He just laughed a little and said, "My older brother's a doctor. He's not rich." Really? Greg was surprised. How come? Because he lives in a part of Idaho where they need a good doctor, but there wasn't a lot of money to pay for one. Greg said, "So how come your brother doesn't move to Chicago or Florida or someplace like that?" Mr. Z shrugged. "We haven't talked about it much, but I know he likes where he lives, and he likes his work there. He's not rich, but he certainly has enough, and for him, enough is enough." Greg said, "Well, I guess that's okay for some people, but I want to be really, really rich. I'm going to make millions and millions." Said Mr. Z. "And what's all this money going to be used for?" he asked. "Money?" Greg looked at Mr. Z as if he was an alien. "What's all the money for? To buy stuff, to go places and get whatever I want, and to do anything I want. That's what money's for." I wonder if you looked back at your list you wrote at the beginning of the story, if you would add to your list of things you would buy if you were rich or had all the money in the world. I might think of a couple things I could add to my list. Mr. Z said, "If you had all the money you wanted, what would you do?" Greg shrugged. "Anything I wanted to? I could do anything?" Mr. Z nodded. "Right, but give me an example." "Okay," said Greg, "like the house we live in now, my parents' house. It's not very big. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a basement, playroom, a family room, just a regular house. So if I had enough money, I'd buy a house with something like 10 bedrooms and 15 bathrooms and 2 swimming pools and this huge entertainment center with a home theater and surround sound and bass boosters and a pool table and air hockey too, stuff like that." Oh, I might do that. And a indoor pool, like, would be so cool. You could do like a soccer field if you like soccer, basketball courts, bowling if you like that, movie theater, party room for disco parties. Ooh, now I'm getting some ideas. Mr. Z raised his eyebrows. Interesting. It was the way Mr. Z said interesting. Something in the tone and the timing. Greg felt a hint of disapproval from the math teacher, and that annoyed him. Greg said, "So you're saying that teachers get paid enough and that you don't want more money, right? And you're saying you don't want a bigger house with fun stuff all over the place and more bedrooms and bathrooms? Is that what you're saying?" We're going to stop there because my phone is telling me we're going to get cut off. Love ya. Bye.